About 4,000 years ago, somewhere along the banks of the Nile, a lone desert predator did something no cat before it had ever dared to do. It didn't run from the humans guarding the grain stores. It didn't attack. It simply stayed. That one small decision helped turn a solitary, short-tempered hunter into a living god, worshipped in temples, mummified by the millions, and today, curled up asleep on your couch. But the real story of how the cat became divine is stranger and a lot darker than you probably think. Rewind to ancient Egypt, somewhere between 4000 and 2000 BCE, along the Nile Valley. Egyptian farmers were producing something the ancient world had never seen at this scale. Massive surplus grain packed into granaries. That grain attracted mice and rats. And the rats attracted the African wildcat, Felis libisa, a solitary territorial hunter built for the desert, with zero interest in being anyone's friend. On paper, this shouldn't have gone anywhere good. The wildcat and the farmer were, at best, uneasy neighbors competing for the same pest problem. And yet, within a couple of thousand years, that same animal was living inside Egyptian homes, sitting at its owner's feet in tomb paintings, and eventually becoming the living image of one of Egypt's most powerful goddesses. So how did a fiercely independent desert predator end up sacred? Archaeologists have been piecing this together for over a century, and the answer keeps changing every time new evidence turns up. Here's the twist before the twist. The oldest evidence of humans and cats together doesn't come from Egypt at all. In 2004, a team led by archaeologist Jean-Denis Vigne uncovered a 9,500-year-old grave on the island of Cyprus, at a Neolithic site called Chilourokambos. Buried just 40 centimeters from a human skeleton was a young wildcat, laid to rest with seashells and polished stones, the kind of burial goods usually reserved for something valued. Cats aren't native to Cyprus, so someone had to have brought this animal there deliberately by boat. This predates any Egyptian cat imagery by more than 4,000 years, so Egypt wasn't first. But Egypt is where the story gets serious. The oldest physical evidence inside Egypt comes from a tomb at Mostagaeta, dated to around 4000 BCE, where archaeologists found cat remains buried alongside feeding pots. Then, in a 2014 study led by Wim van Neer, researchers examined a predynastic cemetery at Hierakonpolis and found something even stranger: a jungle cat skeleton, dated to roughly 3700 BCE, with a leg fracture that had already healed, meaning this animal had been kept in captivity and cared for weeks before it died. Nearby, 6 more cats, 2 adults and 4 kittens, were buried alongside dogs and baboons. That pushed the timeline for Egyptian cat keeping back almost 2,000 years earlier than the old textbook answer, which had always pointed to the Middle Kingdom, around 1950 BCE. Here's the leading theory, and it's a strange one. Nobody really domesticated the cat. The cat may have domesticated itself. This is called the commensal pathway. Egyptian farmers weren't trying to tame a pet. They were trying to protect their harvest. But every grain surplus is a rodent buffet, and every rodent buffet is a magnet for a hungry wildcat. The cats that were just a little bit bolder, a little less afraid of humans, got easier access to food near the villages, and they thrived and reproduced more than their shyer, more skittish relatives. Repeat that selection pressure over hundreds of generations, and you get an animal that's quietly rewiring itself for tolerance of humans, without anyone intentionally breeding it for that trait at all. And as cats became fixtures around Egyptian homes and granaries, something else was shifting alongside them: religion. The cult of the goddess Bastet can be traced back to Egypt's second dynasty, somewhere around 2890 to 2686 BCE, with clear evidence of her worship by the Old Kingdom. But her original form wasn't a cat at all. She was depicted as a fierce lioness, much like the war goddess Sekhmet, a symbol of protection through violence. Only gradually, as the domestic cat wove itself into daily Egyptian life, did Bastet's image begin to soften, from lioness to house cat, from a goddess of retribution to one associated with home, fertility, and motherhood. To really test where domestic cats came from, geneticist Carlos Driscoll and an international team of researchers ran a massive study published in Science in 2007. They analyzed genetic material from 979 cats worldwide, house cats, feral cats, and every wild subspecies of Felis sylvestris, from Europe to Central Asia to Southern Africa. The result? Nearly every domestic cat on Earth traces its maternal ancestry back to one wild subspecies, the Near Eastern wildcat, Felis libica, pointing to an origin in the Fertile Crescent roughly 9 to 10,000 years ago, right alongside the first farming villages. Not Egypt, the Near East. This matched the Cyprus grave almost perfectly. But that wasn't the end of the story. In 2017, a team led by Claudio Ottoni and Eva Maria Geigel published an ancient DNA study in Nature Ecology and Evolution, analyzing genetic material pulled directly from archaeological cat remains across thousands of years and multiple continents. They found two separate waves of expansion: an early slow spread of Near Eastern cat DNA alongside Neolithic farmers, and then, centuries later, a second, far larger wave, when an Egyptian cat lineage exploded outward along maritime trade routes during the Classical period, eventually becoming the dominant ancestor of cats worldwide. One more detail from that study is almost funny. The blotchy, striped, tabby coat pattern that most people picture when they think of a house cat didn't even show up in meaningful numbers until the Middle Ages. Humans weren't selectively breeding cats for looks until thousands of years after domestication had already happened. Here's where the story flips. Newer research from 2025, led by scientists including Marco De Martino and Claudio Ottoni, working alongside archaeozoologist Wim van Neer and Oxford evolutionary biologist Gregor Larsen, is pulling the true birthplace of the modern house cat back to Egypt after all, just far later than anyone expected, around 3,000 years ago. And the driving force wasn't pest control. It was religion. As Bastet's cult exploded in popularity during the first millennium BCE, her imagery shifted fully from lion-headed to cat-headed, and that shift lined up almost exactly with a massive rise in ritual cat sacrifice. Temples began breeding cats deliberately and in huge numbers, not to keep as pets, but to kill, mummify, and sell to pilgrims as offerings to the goddess. We're talking millions of cat mummies, unearthed at sites like Bubastis and Saqqara. To supply an industry like that, priests needed enormous numbers of cats living and breeding in captivity, generation after generation, under tight human control. And that, the forced, industrial-scale, multi-generational confinement of an entire species, is exactly the kind of pressure that can permanently reshape genetics and temperament. Gregor Larsen has a blunt name for this theory: the murder pathway of domestication. Not a slow, gentle story of a wild animal learning to trust us, but millions of ritual deaths accidentally manufacturing a calmer, more people-tolerant cat as a byproduct. To be fair, this isn't settled science. Some archaeologists, like Natalie Monroe at the University of Connecticut, point out the evidence is still far from airtight, and the Cyprus and Near Eastern findings prove that some taming had already been happening for thousands of years before Bastet's cult ever existed. So the truth is probably layered. Cats began cozying up to humans through pest control millennia earlier. But it may have taken a religion built on mass sacrifice to actually mass-produce the modern house cat and send it out into the world. So next time your cat curls up against you and starts purring, here's what's actually behind that moment. Part of that comfort with humans was shaped over more than 9,000 years, starting with a bold wildcat that refused to run from a farmer in Cyprus, continuing through the granaries of the Nile and passing through the temples of Bastet, where millions of its ancestors were bred, worshipped, and sacrificed in the name of a goddess. Your cat isn't just a pet. It's the living result of one of the strangest, most tangled relationships in the animal kingdom. part hunter, part companion, part sacred symbol, and quite possibly part industrial byproduct of an ancient religious economy. So here's the question. Now that you know it might have been mass ritual sacrifice, not affection, that truly turned the wildcat into a house cat, does that change how you look at the one asleep in your home right now? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to keep uncovering the strange, often uncomfortable true stories behind the animals ancient humans domesticated, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.